Hey there, it's Danielle Smith, president of Alberta Enterprise Group. And you're probably wondering if this week we're going to be talking about all of the many changes that we've seen over the last week. We've got emergency measures that have been declared at the federal level. What does it mean? Not so sure. It certainly doesn't mean much in Alberta, as the Coots border crossing ended up getting cleared. And so it doesn't seem like those emergency powers need to be enacted here. So we're going to keep an eye on that. But the reason I think this is important is it seems to me that Alberta is getting back to normal faster than any of the other provinces. And we've been able to see this because the Premier had announced an end to the Restrictions Exemption Act, and it came into effect immediately. Others have been phasing it in. So we're looking across the country, seeing the impact of the mass opposition to continued restrictions. And so there are multiple provinces now that are going to be following suit. First, with ending the restriction exemption program for the most part, and then easing some of the restrictions associated with limits in restaurants and other event spaces. So what does that mean? I mean, there is still obviously a push out there for us to return to restrictions in some corners, or slow the opening up of the economy, or even, heck, I saw Frank Graves, one of the pollsters, saying that we need to mandate third shots, which would presumably mean keeping the restriction exemption program in place until everybody has got a third jab. So this is by no means settled. However, it does seem to me that Alberta is charting a fairly different track and going faster than anyone else. That being said as well, yesterday, I went to an event put on by the Premier. It was the Premier's Fairness for Newcomers Summit. Now, you'll remember that Premier Jason Kenney was Minister of Citizenship and Immigration for 5 years, as well as the Minister for Multiculturalism. And so he knows this area extraordinarily well. He knows the difficulty in getting the foreign credentials of newcomers recognized. And he wanted to have this conference 2 years ago. It was put on hold. The fact that it went ahead now, I think, is a really positive sign. That does seem to me that the Premier's recognizing people are ready to move ahead. But most importantly, he was brimming with excitement about the budget coming down next week. So about 7 days from now, I believe. So this time next week, we're going to see what the provincial finances look like for the year ahead, and be prepared to have your socks knocked off. So Peter Tertsakian just recently wrote a column last month talking about the environment that we find ourselves in now with the energy sector. And one of the things that we've seen is we've got a simultaneous boom happening on bitumen prices, oil prices, natural gas prices. Remember when these were trading negative? Well, that's not going to be the case. In addition, over the last couple of years, you may not have known it, but quietly the industry has increased production. So we're now at 8 million barrels a day in production, 80% of which is generated in Alberta. So we've got higher prices, we've got more production, and we've got takeaway capacity. So not only with Line 3 being completed, but we're going to see the Trans Mountain Pipeline completed by the end of 2022. And we've seen a slowing of the rate of increase. So we do not have the same restrictions that we had before that drove prices down for Western Canada Select and natural gas. So we have the ability to expand production. On top of that, we have now repatriated the ownership of a lot of those energy companies. So the energy companies are now largely owned by Canadian companies. And as a result, if you can't invest in capital infrastructure, I mean, why would anyone bother if you're going to end up putting billions of dollars into an investment process only to have things like, say, the Tech Frontier mine canceled at the last minute? Now you've got a bunch of profits that can also be taxed, generating money for the provincial and federal government. Do you see where this is going? Peter Tertsakian thinks we're going to have $18 billion in resource revenue alone next year. And so the question is, what does that mean for the rest of the economy? When I listened to the Premier yesterday, one of the things he just, as I said, couldn't contain himself over is he thinks that we are set to boom in a way that we haven't seen since 2007, 2008. Now, if you remember 2007 and 2008, you will remember we had mass shortages of qualified labor. I was an advocate at the time for the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, and that was our essentially our number one lobbying priority: is how are we going to get more skilled workers? So this is why it was really important, I think, that yesterday we began the conversation about fairness for newcomers, because not only when we bring professionals in do they need to be able to get their credentials recognized so they can work seamlessly in the area in which they're trained, but we may also need to have a track to ensure that we've got enough workers across the entire economy. Now, what does that have to do with what we're talking about today? There has been, it's almost like we're living a dual reality, because on the one hand, we've had 2 years of restrictions, not being able to have full mobility. We have had a downturn in our economy for 8 years. It's sort of hard to be talking about how next year is going to be so dramatically better when we're still kind of suffering through this transition of what we've gone through over the last little while. There is no industry who has been harder hit, I would put it to you, than the hotel and tourism industry. But that also means there's a lot of pent-up demand. And so it is the industry that is probably going to be set to have the biggest boom as well. Are they ready for it? What are we going to see with shortages of qualified labor? Are you, like what happened to me when I went to Edmonton this week, going to have to make your own bed and clean your own room? Just get prepared for it, because the industry has changed an awful lot. And also, we've got big events that are going to be planned over the summer, biggest of which in Alberta being the Calgary Stampede. What's going to happen this year? Are we going to see Edmonton have its K-Days again this year? Are we going to be back to normal? Joining me to talk about all of this is Saul Zia. He is the president of the Calgary Hotel Association, and he joins me now to talk this through. Saul, thank you so much for being with me today.
Good morning.
So let's begin, because I initially signed you up to talk to me because we were worried that the restriction exemption program was going to continue, and you were pushing to try to make sure that got lifted. Well, congratulations. It's all your advocacy. You managed to have some success there. So tell me what you were thinking a few weeks ago before all of these changes. Give us a sort of a state of where the industry is at.
You know, we were thinking just that. Restrictions were coming down. We were part of a number of advocacy groups across hospitality, travel, and tourism that were calling for restrictions to end. We had to move into, let's call it a normal spring. But there's a term that started to be in the pandemic, the new normal. Danielle, we're entering a new normal. And as much as we're rejoicing over the elimination of restrictions coming to the province and to our neighboring markets like BC and feeder markets further afield but important like Ontario, we will be facing a massive labor shortage. So in parallel to all the work of a number of bodies at the municipal level, provincial and federal level, in parallel, we were always focused on the labor shortage that's coming. And as you put, changes to temporary foreign workers, the ability to bring in newcomers into the industry, because you hit it, your experience at Edmonton, or what we used to experience back in 2005, 06, 07, where you had to wait an hour to get your meal. We're going to open up. You mentioned pent-up demand, and the demand will come in. We will be having a full stampede, and we can talk about that whenever you'd like. But we have to set expectations.
Yeah.
Because if you remember back in 06 and 07 for the hotel industry and the tourism industry, we got terrible grades in customer service from people visiting. So like, there was just a myriad of customer service issues because the expectations were, there would be full service standards. Mm-hmm. And this summer there won't.
Let me talk. You put a lot on the table there. So
sure.
Let's talk about a couple of things that happened this week, because I have traveled now a couple of times, because part of what we do at Alberta Enterprise Group is we try to organize trade missions. So I wanted to see how easy it was to go back and forth across the border. And I'd gone to Phoenix, just came back from Panama, and holy Dinah, trying to get that PCR testing and the cost associated with it. And then you arrive, and some people got singled out for additional testing and the additional cost and the quarantine. It sounds like that has been relaxed. Yesterday, they announced, I was wishing that they would drop the testing requirement altogether when you landed, especially if you have to get a test before you board. But it sounds like they've at least switched it to the rapid antigen test. How important was that change, do you think?
It was very important, Danielle, but it didn't go far enough. So initially, the government, and there's lots of, we can talk about the federal government forever, or not talk about them at all. But originally, the inclination from the feds back in January was to remove testing entirely by March and move to a more European standard of vaccination for boarding an aircraft. And Danielle, you hit it. It's because, and it's not even random. From what I'm hearing from my friends at the airport authority, a near majority of folks are getting tested when they land. So to go through that whole regimen of obtaining a PCR test in countries where there's shortages because they don't do PCR tests, to come in and be tested anyway just didn't seem, it's just not, there's no logic to that. Forget about science. We can talk about science, but logic of tests, because I'm not sure what happens on the airplane. Let's be frank, in those 24 hours before you board the plane and when you arrive. So the big change that happened was the alignment of testing standards between Canada and the United States, the rapid antigen testing. So it was a good move. I believe politics is always at play, but I believe there's other politics that shifted the government away from full removal of testing, knowing that most people are getting tested upon landing. But at least the move on February 28th to align it with the United States is important for our market.
Okay, I don't want to get you in trouble, but what politics do you think were at play? Because it would have been, you're so right. I mean, I can imagine a situation where, fair enough, it's one or the other. Either you have to get tested before you board the plane or you get tested upon arrival. It seems a bit odd, as you say, like, what are you going to do in the 4-hour flight that you have between, what's going to change in that period of time? Not much. It just seems like it's an extra hurdle. But what do you think happened there? What do you think the politics are? Just because if we're going to continue to have this regime, we kind of need to know what politics might be at play.
It's personal opinion, but I think some of the situation in Ottawa and protesting, et cetera, had an impact on the amount of relaxation the government was going to put into. If
I'm interpreting what you're saying, they didn't want to look like they were being pressured to go further than they wanted to, as if they didn't want it to look like the protesters were causing them to make these changes.
I think that's both optics and politics, right? Okay. So you can't fault them for a stage change, but they were looking at something more. They were looking at something that was more logical, aligning with other markets.
What is happening in other markets? What would have been more logical?
Well, in Europe, most of continental Europe, and I believe the UK now just has just vaccination requirements. So the testing requirements, now it varies from country to country, but their movement is driven by vaccination. And in a market where, like our markets, where we're 85, 90% vaccinated, and I'm just speaking very singularly about the travel and tourism industry, we do feed to the majority. That is a function of travel and tourism. So vaccination requirement was fine, along with no testing. So they shifted to rapid antigen testing. And our hope is that it's a temporary change in and of itself.
Right. Well, and there are some, just speaking of Panama had a two-part approach. You could either demonstrate that you'd been vaccinated, or you could show that you had a negative test. And then that allows for anybody who wants to travel to be able to come to Canada. So maybe that's still a potential step too far for our federal government. But that, to me, I don't know how many other nations of the world require vaccination as a necessary condition for coming in. Is that fairly common, or is Panama's hybrid approach a bit more common so that you can at least access the full market? Do you know?
Globally, it would be the hybrid approach between vaccination and testing, but a lot of big markets are pretty tough on vaccination, right? So big destination markets for Canadians back and forth. You think of the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, they do have regimens in place. Many of the continental Europe, I'm not sure about the UK, they keep changing, which is okay. But many European countries have a vaccination standard.
How I guess here's the other sense. What do you think is going to be happening on third tests or fourth tests? I mean, we saw that Israel was really at the forefront of that, changing what it meant to be fully vaccinated. Both Premier Jason Kenney and Doug Ford have said that was contemplated, having a third shot as being a requirement. Do you think we're now past that conversation, or do you still think that there's a potential that they would do that they would change the rules around what it means to be fully vaccinated? Are you involved in any conversations around that to know how it's going?
We are through the Hotel Association of Canada, of which we're members, and the answer is no. Double vaccination at this point is the standard, without any requirement of additional boosters or fourth dose for travel. So
Okay.
always subject to change.
Always subject to change. I know you're always worried that you say something and then a week later it's going to change on you. So let's assume that that's going to be the case, unless some wild new variant comes about. So let's then talk about what our market looks like for going forward. Tell us what the current state is of most hotels. Let me give you a bit of background from what I observed. So Arizona was weird. I went there in September. It's almost like 100% back to normal. So you arrive at the airport, you still have to wear a mask. You go into an Uber, you still have to wear a mask because those are federally regulated industries. But the restaurants were booming and there was no requirement to show a Vax Pass. The hotels were booming, no requirement to show a Vax Pass. I just came back from Panama, totally different story. The hotel I was in, the companion hotel was the Hard Rock, which was something like I think crazy, like 2,000 room, massive hotel. It had been shut down for 2 years because they just didn't have the tourism traffic. The hotel that I was in, the Capitalist, had the ability to house 200 rooms. They told me that they had 5 or 10 rooms booked. Like, we literally had the hotel and the pool to ourselves. And so when I look at how hard hit a hot tourism destination is in January, it made me feel really anxious about what we're facing here. Can you just sort of paint a scene for us?
You know, it's funny you bring up Arizona, and we can talk about the resort markets, but Arizona rolled back on January 15th. And I was just in Arizona and I was looking for it to be wide open, but it didn't feel too different from Alberta. So you went into a gym, you had to wear a mask. They vaccination, no requirement of vaccination, but there was let's call it large scale masking. I don't know how else to express that. For the resort markets, I think it varies for the destinations of Canadians. I think some of the smaller markets have been really badly hit, like Costa Rica, Panama, some of the secondary markets, and there's good reasons for that. And that was the cutback in air capacity by WestJet. Necessary. I'm not judging their businesses, but WestJet, Air Canada, Air Transat, all of the Sunwing, they had to reduce their capacity to address the market. So if a plane full of Canadians or Americans doesn't land in Panama, well, there's really not going to be any demand for the hotel. So it's a chicken and egg situation where the capacity cutbacks that WestJet and Air Canada had to put in place, and then the smaller charter carriers, has that impact for those markets like a Costa Rica, Panama, Nicaragua, some of those markets in Central America. But at the same time, capacity was kept fairly robust in markets like the Dominican and Mexico.
So bring it closer to home, because I'm curious about what that means for Alberta then. If fewer people are traveling internationally, does that then create an opportunity for the hotel industry? Are you seeing that some of those dollars are staying here and it's not quite as bad, or is it devastating? So give us, maybe we can talk about it in terms of the two major markets, then we'll talk about some of the smaller markets. What's happening in Calgary?
So in Calgary, it's still been devastation. And Danielle, the reason is we rely on corporate and business travel. And you talked about the budget coming next week and the resurgence in drilling and exploration and in production. And we rely on that. So it's a tale of two cities when you look at Alberta. So the resort markets have been absolutely well fed by domestic travel. You see the same in British Columbia. You see the same in Ontario.
Let me make sure I know which ones those would be. So I'm thinking that means Waterton, Banff, Jasper. Am I missing any?
Lake Louise.
Louise. So those have been fine all the way through?
Well, I mean, fine's a relative word, but in comparison to Calgary, better, right? So I know going into the summer, a market like Banff is already 75% booked. So if you're planning on going to Banff this summer, well, you better hustle, because 3/4 of the rooms, as it is today, for the summer are already booked. Wow. Leaving just a quarter for the last minute traveler, for the local traveler, which goes back to 05 and 06 and 07, where we would day trip to Banff because you couldn't stay over, or you'd go further and further east in the Canmore area. But in Calgary, we've been the lowest national market of any urban in December. And it's sort of funny, we were only behind Moncton in terms of overall occupancy. And that's only because probably one meeting canceled in Moncton. Their denominator is low. But we have been every month the lowest urban market Calgary has. And that's because we do rely on corporate travel. That flow north and south between just Calgary and Houston, it's incalculable, the impact of that reduction in movement between Houston and Calgary.
So first of all, it's interesting you should say that, because I initially had booked my flight to get to Panama with Houston as the stopover point, and it got canceled, and I had to get routed through Toronto, which was a whole nightmare in itself. But that really surprised me, that there wasn't enough traffic going directly between Calgary and Houston to maintain that flight. And so I take your point, because I've seen it myself then. But when going back a step, when you said that Calgary has been the lowest occupancy market of all the major centers, we need to get a sense of how much capacity we have for rooms, and then also that percentage of occupancy. How do you measure that in your industry?
Well, it's measured by rooms available. Right. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we had about 14,500 rooms in the city. Okay. We're actually down to around 13,000 rooms. We've had 1,000 rooms exit the market. Some major hotels have been converted to housing, and that's a situation as well. I'm gonna bring it to Stampede, and once again we can talk about Stampede again and again. But a few of the McLeod Trail South hotels, where folks regularly drive in from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, park their trailers, they've been converted to they're not hotels anymore. And we actually,
you better tell me which ones they are, because I used to go to the Carriage House inside. I'm familiar with a few of those on
Carriage House is fine. The Holiday Inn McLeod Trail South, and temporarily the Days Inn on McLeod Trail. So those ones are pretty close to Stampede grounds, and they're no longer operating as hotels. And we've, even with 500,000 attendees for Stampede, we felt it last year, because people would pull up and like, this hotel's closed. And those were important hotels for the rubber tire traffic, as we call them, folks, because big parking lots, you could park your trailer, come in from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Stampede, have your hotel. Well, we've had changes in capacity. So that is, we met with a bunch of the hotels, met with Councillor Terry Wong here in Calgary, and said, well, we may not need more hotels in the city, but we can't afford less. Because if that's a service standard and a type of hotel that people rely on, they may not want to stay at the Hyatt.
Truly, and when you mentioned that it's been converted to a long-term rental, that doesn't convert back very easily, if at all. I mean, there are some hybrid hotels that I've seen in Vancouver, Holiday Inn, incidentally, where they do have two towers, and a certain portion of them are either condoized and owned or rented out, and then the others are operated as hotel rooms. But it strikes me that's not a very easy conversion to do, and we've got a pretty short time horizon here. We're February already, and if we're talking about that big rush of tourists coming, it's only this July. It's only 5 months from now.
It's a big rush of tourists, and we have hopefully a lot of large conferences and events coming to the city. Global Rotary conference and convention, I believe over 5,000 delegates coming into the city. We need our infrastructure and capacity.
How are we served relative? So if we do fast forward to, it's kind of back to the future, looking at what we had in 2008, how many rooms do we need to have? And with the extra convention space, it seems to me, based on what we're talking about here, that not only can we not afford to lose hotels, we might actually see a need to expand, which creates an opportunity, because we do have a lot of empty downtown office towers, and we've been talking about doing condo conversions or rental conversions. Maybe actually makes more sense to be thinking about hotel conversions. You just sort of planted a seed with me. So I just want to get an idea of, number one, are we going to need to see more rooms? And then number two, is it practical to think about converting some of those buildings downtown?
Wow, that's a hornet's nest you just entered into. Yeah. I mean, I would think as an industry, the notion of converting all the commercial, or a big chunk of commercial, into residential, that doesn't help the downtown hotel industry, because we need to serve a corporate traveler. It will come back, and as you said, the boom will come, and the expectation is the city is ready and available for that. The number that we throw around in the industry is 12,000 rooms. We can't afford to fall below 12,000 rooms because we become less competitive to comparable Canadian markets like Ottawa, Gatineau. So we can't, as an industry, fall below that. We had one new hotel open in 2021, and we have a new hotel opening in 2022. So we have a little bit more capacity, but we've had more rooms exiting. But we need to stabilize. And I'm going to bring it back, and we need to hire, and we need to be attractive to hire. I'm going to throw in a third element in there, and I would keep singing things at you. Our institutions need support, academic institutions. So SAIT's hospitality program, one of the largest in the country, has been battered because kids coming out of high school who are thinking about management degrees in hospitality and tourism. Oh, put it this way, Danielle, if you were finishing high school now with good grades, would you apply to an honors HB, like a business administration program with a specialty in tourism? Or would you consider the industry tarnished?
Complete. I know exactly what you're saying, because we had a summer student last year from the professional cooking program, and he was a little out of practice because a lot of what he had to do was online and outside the classroom. So I can only imagine how difficult that would be for all of the tourism based professions. And you're right. I mean, I've seen this as well in the energy sector. There's been a lot of exit from guys who work in the field, because if you have this up and down in the economy and you need to have sustained income, is the industry reliable enough to be able to sustain that in the long term? And I'm hearing you say there's some similar considerations that might be happening right now in your sector.
Yeah, and it goes beyond temporary. So absolutely, when you look at the tiers, temporary foreign worker rules have to be changed and adapted. And honestly, I don't buy the notion that newcomers are entering into categories where other Canadians don't want to work. Many countries around the world, people come from hospitality schools. You look at India, the Philippines, they attend hospitality schools. They can come here with credentials. Secondly, international students. So into SAIT, University of Guelph in Ontario, the large hospitality programs need to be supported. And this is where the government needs to come in. The industry needs to be attractive again. I heard Minister Doug Schweitzer talk about, he understands and is cognitive of the fact that the industry, the reputation has gone down, and we need to attract workers to it. And government has a role in advocating for the industry in that respect.
Let's talk a little bit about what kind of changes you need to see the temporary foreign worker program, because this has always been the push and pull in the immigration system, and it's caused so much frustration to me because, and I sat with a group of businessmen yesterday who all told me their story of coming to Canada, that they have this point system, and so they've got degrees and they've got masters and they're lawyers and they're doctors, or their wives are nurses, and they think, oh right, got this high point system. When I show up, they're just going to be offering me jobs as soon as I get off the plane. But in fact, that doesn't work because we don't recognize foreign credentials. So you end up with really highly educated people who end up not being able to get careers in their profession. Many of the gentlemen I spoke with yesterday, they said, well, I couldn't get my job with my master's in chemistry or with my background in child sexual exploitation social work. And so I worked at, in the one case, it was 7-Eleven, and another case, an individual started at a Chinese food restaurant, and another one was driving cab. And it strikes me that we need to have our immigration and temporary foreign worker program aligned with the industries that need the jobs. So don't go and attract, chemical engineers and then expect them to work in the hotel and tourism industry. Attract people who are professionals in the hotel and tourism industry and bring them in through the temporary foreign worker program. So I think you and I are aligned on that, but I'm wondering how aligned our government programs are on that. What is the situation right now with temporary foreign workers?
The situation is we require workers, and I think the reason is historically, and it continues to be, and I think a lot of the advocacy that groups like mine did, the Alberta Hotel and Lodging Association, tourism tends to be a marginalized, and that it's a tough word, but a marginalized industry. It's not the same as tech. It's not in oil and gas. Of course, we treasure oil and gas in the province, but it is a high focus industry. So the temporary foreign workers, you hit it. We don't bring in those type of hospitality workers who've completed a college, a certificate program overseas. We don't make it easy for those folks to come in. But the jobs are available. So people come in with an engineering degree because of how we've regimented it. They still end up in a hospitality job of some sort. But there are folks who are qualified. And I think it's because of tourism typically being on the margins and not being one of those major high focus industries or job categories for government.
And I think part of it is there's a perception that there's a lower wage that's available in the sectors. Maybe you can tell us what's happened on, before I get to the wages, first you should tell me, when you said that we had the lowest occupancy, we had 14,500 rooms, we went into 13,000. What was the typical occupancy? Was just so I know how you calculate it. Was it percentage? I may have missed what you said. I just want to make sure I understand where we're coming from.
In December, downtown Calgary is around 30%.
30%. Okay.
And usually with Christmas, New Year's Eve, we'd be hovering in the high 50s or 60s.
Oh.
In January, though, with Omicron, it's probably downtown Calgary's around 18%, maybe.
And what would you normally see in a January?
40 to 45%, right? So you might say, well, that's not too bad, but it's 100%. I mean, that's 100%. We're off by huge percentages. And, it's that hole we're digging. If you have a lost quarter, you got to make it up somewhere else.
Completely. I'm interested in your industry because I'm assuming it's very similar to the restaurant business, where it's basically dead zone normally from January through to March. And then once spring hits, we start seeing business pick up. And then we're booming from July until about September. And with Christmas parties and that sort of thing, do pretty well all the way through to December. Is that fairly consistent with what you see in hotels?
You got it. Like that's Calgary in a nutshell, in terms of how to move through hospitality through the year.
So we're in a period right now where you'd be looking to do your hiring to get ready for high season. So what kind of jobs are available right now in the industry? Where are you having the hardest time recruiting?
It used to be a few months ago that it was around food and beverage and catering, but now it's every category again. Maintenance, housekeeping, front desk. Where we're seeing the most sensitive logistic, though, is management, right? Where people are not coming in or applying. A finance person leaves, there's not a cadre of finance people to hire in that. So some of the management piece is the one that's most worrisome, because when you drive that up, you jeopardize running the operation.
And let's talk about what has happened in the industry, because under the previous NDP government, we saw the minimum wage go up to $15 per hour. What kind of impact did that have on the tier categories for salaries in your industry?
Back then, it had an initial impact on profitability, but if pre-pandemic, it wasn't like the economy was great. Like you said, 2019 was. Before all this happened, 2020 was supposed to be a re-emerging year for our economy, right? Then the pandemic hit and that all got rolled back. But yes, back when wages were increased, it had a serious impact on profitability, because you had this whole ride. And someone goes from whatever it was to 15. The 15-hour worker had to go up. So there was an initial hit, which wasn't matched with a revenue bump. But but now for the most part, hotels are paying well above minimum wage just to attract workers.
I guess I want to ask the other question about Airbnb and the impact it's had on the industry, because I go back and forth. I mean, sometimes I'll use a hotel if it's convenient, if I'm only there for a day or two. If I've got a longer stay, I kind of like having the kitchen facilities. So I like to go Airbnb. So I feel like I can go back and forth between the two different types. But I'm wondering if you're seeing an Airbnb effect on the hotel industry that you can measure.
There's definitely an Airbnb effect when you get into the short-term rentals, like the medium stay. And you're right, there are corporates who, if they're here for 3 months, want the long stay hotel, or they want the Airbnb. It's a choice. I think the biggest issue we see with Airbnb is the lack of level playing field. Now, I'm going to applaud the provincial government first, because they are taking additional measures to make sure that an Airbnb is taxed as fairly. And this will come into the budget that you talked about, that they are taxed as fairly as a hotel.
Does that mean that, because we have we have a tourism tax of 4%, don't we, on hotel rooms? And then a portion of that goes into a tourism fund. Is that what you're talking? Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going based on historical memory here. But is that the one that you're looking at trying to get parity on?
Correct. Alberta Tourism Levy, which is set at 4%, which all accommodation providers are to remit that based on guests coming in. But Airbnb had a number of loopholes in their platform. And then Expedia and Booking, a number of the other distribution platforms, had loopholes where they weren't collecting that from guests like a hotel would and not remitting it. So the Alberta government is closing those loopholes. It actually reduces red tape because it's just a universal, if you're staying in an accommodation and you're a host, whether it's a hotel or an Airbnb, you remit the 4% based on the revenue collect. Our dilemma is the city hasn't quite got around, so there's a lot of tax gaps for the city. And I think we're approaching somewhere, I don't have the exact numbers because I don't chair the Airbnb Association, between 4,000 to 5,000 units in the city, the vast majority of which are taxed as residential.
And that's a pretty big difference. So correct my memory, but they did consolidate the business occupancy tax with the business property tax, and then they've been bringing it down. But I still thought that the amount of tax on sort of the same assessed value of property was almost 3 times as much for a business property like a hotel versus a residential property. Again, are my numbers right?
You've done your homework. Bang on. Yeah. So at a square foot level, it's residential is about 35% versus non-residential. So if there are, let's say 4,500 Airbnb units, the majority tax is residential. That's a revenue gap for the city versus hotels that remit a commercial tax.
Of course, what I would like to see is closer parity, bringing the non-residential rate down. I mean, in the community I live in High River, it's 1.5 times. So it's only a 50% increase as opposed to 300%. It would make a huge difference if we were able to bring down the rates that businesses like yours and others in the hospitality industry would pay as well. Do you have any particular lobbying agenda that you have on that front? Are you asking for the Airbnb guys to be brought up, or are you asking for your taxes to be brought down, or meet in the middle somewhere?
Meet in the middle. You're absolutely right. Like our assessment process for hotels to bring it down, and then at least for the Airbnbs to bring them in at the commercial level. And that actually helps the city, right? Because you can't tax businesses to death, but you also can't leave categories that are legitimate businesses untaxed or taxed at a lower level.
All right. I'm going to have to think a little more on that, because some people only rent their Airbnb out for a portion of the year. So I'm trying to figure out how that might end up working. But that's a story for another day, speaking to the head of the Airbnb Association, not you. So, but thanks for raising that. Are there any other parity issues that you want to put on the table?
No, there's no other parity issues. I mean, I think the provincial government, when you brought up the Alberta Tourism Levy, they abated it for the hardest hit markets, and we lobbied heavily for abatement, and the provincial government did come through with a revenue tested approach. It got a lot of attention in other provinces. And I got a report from Manitoba saying, oh, this is interesting what Alberta did. Revenue tested abatement of a level of tax, allowing those organizations that had fairly no revenue to keep that tax collection. So it was smart. It was a smart move by the government, and we applauded it.
Just so I'm sure I understand, did that money come back so rather than pay the 4%, or you paid the 4% and then you got a tax return, or is that what happened? Or did the hotel, or did the various tourism associations not get the associated revenue in a given year?
I don't know how the balance sheet for that worked, but you hit it earlier. The 4%. That's collected is kept by the hotel. And for the most part these days, it's being pumped back into payroll.
Okay, perfect. Let's talk a little bit about where that 4% goes, because it doesn't just go into general revenues, right? It goes to fuel the tourism advertising of the different agencies that are responsible for it. So tell us a little bit about what you're expecting to see on that front.
We're hopeful in the budget, and there was actually a lot of good work in the last budget focusing more of the Alberta Tourism Levy money to Travel Alberta. So Travel Alberta, our provincial destination marketing organization, historically and under previous governments, the Alberta Tourism Levy went into general revenue, and it was very difficult for it to be identified as going towards supporting travel and tourism. The government did a great job in the last budget in focusing on that, and we expect more in this budget.
Well, and I must say, I've seen a pretty stellar ad from Travel Alberta that pieces together all of the movies that have been filmed here. And because it's Hollywood production values, it's just amazing. You're watching it thinking, did that happen in Alberta? So it's so interesting to have that kind of marketing ability, and obviously getting it into the market so people can connect their favorite shows that they love with where they were filmed. I think it's amazing. What about our municipal entities? Tell us a little bit about Tourism Calgary and the companion up in Edmonton.
So Travel Alberta, through the pandemic, Travel Alberta and Tourism Calgary have been working more closely together, and Travel Alberta's mandate has been to fund destination marketing organizations such as Tourism Calgary, Explore Edmonton. I'm sure there's Tourism Red Deer, for instance. So there's been more effective utilization of the tourism levy to Travel Alberta. There's been then more effective distribution by Travel Alberta to the municipal destination marketing organizations. So there's been definitely improvements in efficiency, which is good. We want improvements in efficiency in terms of how funds are used to market at the provincial, national level, international level, and then at the local level.
All right. What do you anticipate? I don't know if are you able to tell us a little bit about the Edmonton market by way of comparison? Do you know how many rooms they have? And I'm assuming they've been even harder hit because they are festival central. I've been to the Folk Fest there and the Fringe Fest, and they normally have K days, but I think they've ended up having, we at least in Calgary got to have the Calgary Stampede, which was a major boon. But I think that Edmonton ended up seeing many of their festivals on hold for the last couple of years, which has got to have been pretty painful. Can you provide us some context there?
Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but Edmonton has done much better than Calgary.
Really? Good for Edmonton.
And that's less to do with leisure and more to do with government. So that baseline of government travel, I've actually got a report and I'd be happy to share it with you. I'm looking at the Edmonton versus Calgary. And for context, in November of last year, downtown Calgary's occupancy was 30%. Downtown Edmonton's, which is actually comparable amount of rooms, is 41%. So as a market, now they're let's call it suburban markets were a bit further down than Calgary, but they ended up 3 points higher than us.
It makes sense. I mean, I have to go to Edmonton to do lobbying and meetings, and so I stay at hotels there. And you're right, I haven't stayed at a Calgary hotel for some time, because I still think most travelers' context is tourism, but you're right. The bigger context is what kind of business do you have to do, and the business of government continues on regardless of what the conditions are. So that's helpful to understand that. Let's then talk though about the labor shortage issue once again that you're facing, because I want people to know and be prepared for what they should be expecting in the summer. Let's assume things continue on. Let's assume all of the marketing internationally works and there's more staycations, so Albertans are traveling to different destinations. Just bring everybody's expectations down. What is it we're going to expect from a service side?
What I expect is an exhausted workforce as we go in. So looking at Calgary alone, just in the hotel industry, and I'm sure Ernie Sue with the Restaurant Association would be able to reveal more. We're going into the summer with at least 500 or 600 vacant positions. And when you straddle that through, you're going to end up with a lot of exhausted folks who, end their shift in the restaurant, go and make beds. When we had a plumbers conference here in August, which was great. I mean, it was fantastic to have a conference. It was in that kind of, as we've seen, halo periods between restrictions. But I had a meeting with one of the general managers of one of the hotels, and he was valeting cars and loading bags. And because everyone has to pitch in, and I even offered to help, but I guess there's probably insurance liability if I do that sort of stuff. But we're going to see more of the same, like an exhausted workforce, because if you can't add people, you add hours. And that's my inclination as we go in. And I think you'll see a lot of that in the Banff, Lake Louise, Jasper as well, where we're just not able to, there's not enough effective valves or a funnel or pipeline, if you want to call it that, of people to fill those positions.
It's funny you should say that. I remember every time I go to a resort destination, one of the mountain parks, you see so many workers from New Zealand and Australia, and they have had stricter lockdown measures and travel restrictions than we have. So that probably cut off one of our major pipelines, I would think.
It did. It create, if you're a 20-year-old coming from Australia, you don't want to sit in your captive residence in Banff for 2 weeks in quarantine through. It's just not the experience that these younger people want. They want a rich. There's fun. They come here to have fun, and enjoy the country and work. But I think the cultural shift that occurred during some of those dark days of the pandemic with workers from overseas who were literally stuck in a room for 2 weeks. I can't remember what it was like to be 20, but I don't think I would have liked that.
Let me ask you, is there an opportunity for gig workers to be working in your industry? And the reason I ask that is that we just recently made a hire at Alberta Enterprise Group, and my scheduler said, "Here's what you have to do. You have to post the job 9 a.m. until 2 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and you'll get all kinds of resumes." And sure enough, we got 200 resumes in the space of 2 days, which made me think that perhaps the model that we have, where we expect people to work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, is maybe not what people want anymore. And maybe people want to have, I drive a little bit of Uber and I do an Airbnb and I work for a few hours a day, and they put together a full-time income based on a bunch of different gig jobs. And I'm wondering if there's if you're observing the same thing, or if there's any response that the hotel industry is doing to perhaps a different expectation of what workers want.
That's an interesting observation, and the answer is yes. You are seeing that sort of casual labor, folks coming in through the temporary placement offices to do things such as maintenance. There are a number of things within hospitality, a lot of kitchen work, dishwashers, for instance. So there is quite a bit of that happening. I just don't know whether it fills the gap. Right.
Okay.
And if it's a beautiful day, because what are you competing against? If it's a beautiful day in July, I don't know if that worker, they might want to go to the mountains or bike or whatever they do, because they're managing their own hours. So it's that yin yang of, well, on the days where you need people the most are the days that are least attractive for people to work.
Truly. And
a cloudy day like today is probably great.
well, talk to me a bit about as well, if there are people thinking, there's all these jobs available, what would I be looking at? Because there's some pretty there's some night shift hours that are offered in the industry as well. Is there a fairly typical type of schedule that you have that you have openings for? Is it a typical 9 to 5 Monday to Friday job? I wouldn't think so. So why don't you tell me what the hours look like?
I mean, for most of the industry outside of events, it's very early morning work, right? We're talking like a 5 a.m. to 2 p.m., 2 or 3 p.m. So it does cater towards having an evening and an afternoon. There is, audit and front desk and all that, but it's a much lower proportion of what's available. Most of the jobs are right now are daytime, early daytime. But as we get into events and Stampede, there's going to be a need for evening workers.
Okay. Let's then talk about, as we get into Stampede. Are we going to get into Stampede? I'm assuming since we had Stampede last year and restrictions have eased, and it looks like both the cities are following the provincial lead, not only on dropping the restriction exemption program, but masks, which are set to drop on March the 1st. Is it full steam ahead in Stampede, or is there still some uncertainty?
That's a loaded question. It is full steam ahead, and it is uncertainty coming from, the public ranks. So that there's maybe concern from some publicly, but it's full steam ahead. And our job is to make sure the industry is ready to deliver on Stampede. And I think of all of hospitality, it's not just hotels, it's restaurants, it's bars, it's nightclubs. It's the whole ecosystem that supports Stampede. We need to be ready. So we're actually trying to work with the Tourism Calgary Stampede to make sure that our industry is fully briefed, ready. How can we support? There was a lot of, last year Stampede was like, is it going to happen? Okay, now it's happening, but it dropped, right? Sort of like someone coming out of a parachute, now we're landing and you better go. And we did our best. But I mean, the hustle in that week before Stampede and even the day of Stampede was tremendous.
Well, tell me what that looked like, because I held an event immediately. I think we held at AEG the first business event in Canada, because Alberta was the first one to reopen. And so I remember July 1st it was announced, and July 2nd we had our first event. And it seemed seamless to me. I didn't notice any shortfalls in service or staffing, but that's from a customer perspective. What was it like from your perspective? Because it would have been, and then we also actually held an event in Calgary for Stampede, and we also held a companion one up in Edmonton. So from a customer perspective, it looks like everybody was ready to go. What was, if you pull back the curtain, what was actually going on, and what are you hoping to avoid this time?
Well, I think the difference between last year and this year is energized workforce. So people put in the hours, put in the hustle. I'll give you an example. So we work very closely with Stampede, but historically it's been more around packaging and events. Well, I think it was the day before the parade, the virtual parade. We got 4,000 tickets to bundle with hotels, 4,000 evening show, grandstand event tickets that we had to someone distribute to the hotels. The hotels had no time to bundle it. It was a terrific surprise and delight. But you would market having tickets based on some sort of package, that wherever the traveler is coming from. And it's no fault of Stampede, it's no fault of ours, but all of a sudden we had to hustle and distribute all this great stuff for people coming in. But it was surprise and delight because they didn't know when it arrived. Now, if you're going to get free grandstand tickets when you check into your hotel, no one's going to complain about that. But it was quite literally the day before Stampede.
Oh, it would have been a better marketing opportunity if you'd known further in advance. Well, what do you hope? What do you hope happens this year? Is there any just sort of bell you want to ring, just so that everybody is making the decisions now, to make sure that we have that we're fully up to capacity?
Dream a little dream.
Yeah, me as well. Put it out there, Saul.
I mean, for Stampede, what you want to do is even demand, right? So Stampede has 2 weekends where all the demand is, and then you kind of have this lull during the week, and we'd love to distribute more of the demand across the entire 10 days, and including the day before and the day after. There's always the day after. But anything we can do to flatten that. So if people want to come and they want to do the evening show and they know they get free tickets on a Wednesday, or they get tickets with their hotel room, they might shift from, and nothing wrong with the weekend, but if you can shift that over, now that's the dream, a little dream, because we're going in more prepared, but with little time to distribute that demand.
That makes sense. And I was going to say maybe that K-Days, I'm assuming it's going to go ahead this year. I thought maybe they'd have a harder time scaling up, but since they've had more consistent occupancy, it might actually be easier for them to get back full steam ahead in the Edmonton region with their events this year.
I think so. And I think Edmonton has done a good job of, between their hotel association and their destination marketing organization, to coordinate. So I think they are entering into better shape as they get back into festivals, because it is a festival city. But so is Calgary in a way. We just need to have more focus on the other festivals, like Chinook Blast happening right now in the city of Calgary. So they will be, I think we will all collectively be prepared. It's just, what keeps me up at night is that workforce challenge.
Yeah, completely. So if you've got those workforce challenges in Calgary and Edmonton, which presumably will be relatively easy to attract workers, what happens to some of the satellite towns and cities?
I think, we basically are all playing off each other. There was one interesting, so last year, Banff and Calgary talked about actually moving our workforce in buses between the two cities to manage the summer. It never really got off the ground because the logistics were just, we didn't have enough time to build the logistics, but I think there'll be an impact on workforce. If you want a job in a restaurant or in a hotel for the summer, you can pick where you want to go. If you want to go to Banff, so that does impact, let's say, a market like Drumheller, which also has a high level of tourism, but might have a different level of competition with Calgary, Edmonton, Banff, Lake Louise, Jasper, Waterton.
Right.
Same for Grand Prairie, Fort Mac, Grand Cache, like all the smaller markets that do have considerable hotel capacity. I think they're all entering into a worry about workforce.
I believe it. Tell me what people should expect for pricing, because I have stayed. I'm going to be staying at the Kananaskis Lodge in the next couple of weeks, and I am. Good thing I have a plan to be at a conference in Banff in August as well. So I better make sure that I've got my rooms booked. Thanks for the warning on that. But I am curious to see what people should be expecting for the price tag, because it's a bit of a sticker shock when you go to the mountain parks, and yet in Edmonton it's readily available that you can get rooms for less than $100 a night. And so I'm sort of interested in the pricing policy that's happening, because you would think that some of the prices would escalate because hoteliers are making up for lost time and lost business, or do you keep them low so that you encourage a greater volume of people coming out knowing that they're going to have an affordable rate? What do you think is going to happen there?
Rates will increase, but they'll continue to be deals. That's what we'll see in the major urbans like Calgary and Edmonton. So depending on where you go, there'll be some capacity, and some available. So, the notion is called compression. Let's say downtown is full, people just start moving out into different quadrants. See the same in Edmonton. So we will see rates go up in Calgary and Edmonton, but nowhere near the rate escalation you'll see in the resort markets. So if people are considering Banff, Lake Louise, Jasper, Waterton, Kananaskis, as you brought up, Canmore, it's best to book ahead. But that actually benefits the northwest of Calgary, right? So it was always a base camp to the Rockies for some folks who would just stay, in the far northwest towards Winsport, Canada Olympic Park, and then day trip into the Rockies. So we will see some advantage to that. That was a thing before. But I think that's actually something to keep an eye on as we get into, let's call it the boom year. If 2023 is the boom year, you'll see a lot more of that, because that was a phenomenon in 2007 where people would stay in Airdrie to go to Stampede. People would stay in High River and Okotoks, Diamond. And we might see more of that, which is okay. It's part of regional tourism. There's no disadvantage to someone staying in Chestermere and coming in. We'd love to host them in Calgary, but we understand the phenomenon of rate and capacity. But it's going to be tough to get, I've heard rates of $600-700 for the resorts. But
wow.
I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. The rates will be higher, but there will still be deals.
You know what I don't understand about the business model in hotel, and maybe just in our sort of final minutes here, you can help me understand that. I just don't know how any of these hotels have been able to survive with such low occupancy over such a long period of time. It strikes me that there's only a few things that I can consider. One is that so much of your cost is staff, and so you were able to very quickly compress the amount of staff you had, and so you save money there. Or that you've built your business model over having a very low occupancy, so the rest of it is gravy. Or it's been the supports that have been given from various levels of government and tax break reprieves. It seems almost impossible that your industry could be a hit as hard as it has been for 2 years. And we've only seen two hotels, or a handful of hotels that have had to do a conversion to long-term rental. It's actually quite remarkable that we haven't seen more devastation. So what's going on there? Why is it that you've managed to weather through?
Well, the devastation might still be coming. So I'll start with that as a negative. But it's like, so half the hotels in the city are family-owned, well-managed, well-run businesses, run by very smart business leaders. The balance are owned by, national or multinational companies, also effectively managing. But it's like any other household. They did a great job of managing the reserve and going in. So the rainy day funds for many of the hoteliers, and I think of the family-owned hotels, they had reserve for about a year and a half. They had that 18-month reserve. But the devastation that you bring up, like we're actually entering into the reopening period. And what I keep warning government is, but folks can't write any more checks. Some of these local families, 2 years of reserve, any household, a rainy day fund doesn't last 2 years for a household. And that's true of any efficient business. There are some who, they don't live paycheck by paycheck, but those reserves are drying up. And the revenue is coming, but if you look at, there's this shift. If you look at March, April, and May are going to become difficult times to write those checks because the revenue is so pushed further forward.
Yeah.
The bank account is dry. The government programs end in May. And there could be a bit more devastation to the market because once the bank calls, you've got to pay, and that is a worry as well. That
I can see what you're saying, because if the revenues are back end loaded on the year, and you're essentially going to be able to make up your losses and start putting money aside between May and December, what a shame if the bank calls the loan in in May, and you've got a bridge period. Have the banks been pretty good though to deal with though? It seems to me as well. I would expect that most hotels own not only the building but also the land that they're situated on, and maybe that gives you a bit more leverage in negotiating with the banks.
It varies. Some of the hotels own fully the land plus the surrounding retail. Some of them lease the dining space to others. They can think of examples of that. So the business models vary. And one of our criticisms of all the government programs is it didn't address when things vary. So let's say a hotel which is empty but has a perimeter of retail, and retail was allowed to stay open through all of this. They were treated the same as a hotel was purely a hotel. And their revenue footprint was different. So we had to get into a lot of petitioning and application to get those hotels served for support programs as well as others.
Right. And also restaurants would have been a very strong source of revenues, but those were closed or abridged for a lot of the time during the year. I don't even know if most restaurants have already reopened. Maybe you can tell me, or if room service is even available. When you talk about what your expectation is when you go into a hotel, are we at a point where things have scaled up where you can get room service and you can eat at a hotel? Because it wasn't that way all the time.
It was a variety. I mean, a lot of you brought up film and TV. So a lot of the business during those dark days was film and TV productions. Mm-hmm. So when it's, I can't remember the name of the big HBO production. Huge.
Is that one, Last of Us?
Last of Us, yeah, Last of Us. I mean, some hotels had hundreds of production folks in, so they got very good at room service and adapting and working with the Skip the Dishes or Uber Eats or with local restaurants. So there was a lot of adaptation that restaurants. So I think room service is there, and then the expansion of that footprint to cater to the guests' requirements. We also saw the same with the curling bubble last year, and then women's hockey, where people were bubbled in their hotels, but there was enough variety of food to keep hopefully most people happy. Sure, they couldn't go out to a restaurant because they were bubbled, but there was an expansion of that food service and food variety. The government did a good job of allowing, liquor delivery until 24/7 really to hotels. So they changed the city, and we can be critical or positive about the city, but they did relax they did cut out a lot of red tape on things such as ability to deliver anything to a room at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m. Because why would it matter? It's it's like an extension of your residence, really.
Completely. I hope. Do you have an indication that all of that will stay? Because sometimes there's a reprieve during a period of crisis, and then it's okay. Let's boomerang back to where we were before. But you're right. Why wouldn't you keep some of those things?
My hope is that it stays, and the city has done a good job of working with businesses through the committees and task forces they set up. It gave a much greater voice to hospitality. I think at some of those meetings, the hospitality folks were quite prominent. So I hope that stays. And I don't have any indications that the city government will shift in that business support mindset it's in.
All right. Tell us as well what we should be expecting this year, because it's been, it's been one step forward, two steps back. What do you know of the big events that are coming to town that are confirmed for 2022? Or when you said 2023 will be the boom year, is it still that there's some uncertainty?
Well, I mean, we will have some great events. I mean, there's some really fun stuff coming to the city. We have the National Brewery Awards coming here. I believe it's May. You could fact check me on that. And that's fun for the city of Calgary, because who doesn't love a microbrew? I know Premier Kenny's looking forward to some good microbrew during St. Patrick's Day. I think he's probably hunting for a good Irish pub to head to. We also have the Country Music Awards coming this fall. Like we have a lot of cool events outside of our treasured stampede that'll keep the city busy. And they should be, I think we're at the end of virtual events, hopefully. But we do have a lot that takes us right through to Christmas time of some big events. Part of it is just getting the word out. And no one's announced that we have the Country Music Awards this year. But, there's so much distracting news. Like entertainment news has a hard time breaking through because there's so much clutter of negativity. But I'm looking forward to even go to the Brewery Awards. I don't know how you get in, but I'd love to check that out and see.
Hey, if you find out, you let me know, because I want to go as well. And you've just announced these ones, so people now know about it. But you're right. I mean, that's the thing that I think is going to be a really interesting transition, because all business news has had a hard time breaking through over these last 2 years, because everything has been centered around the COVID response and the COVID impact. Won't it be nice for us to be talking about some good news stories again, and looking at metrics in the industry and being able to push some of this positive news out again, because it has been a long time.
Yeah, maybe the Flames and the Oilers will make the playoffs this year. Let's see what happens. I mean,
holy cow, we can only hope. Wouldn't that be amazing? So is there anything else that I didn't ask you that we should know about? You've touched on so many issues, and I just want to make sure that we know where some of the trouble spots might be. If we can lend our voice to assisting your industry, we are more than happy to do that. But you've given me a few areas that I know I got to keep an eye on. Anything else before I let you go?
I think my biggest message to corporate Alberta is to have a level of patience that you maybe haven't had to have in other summers, because workforce challenges are invisible when you're hosting an event. And like you said, your events went great, but I'd love for corporate Alberta to recognize that our industry is going to have some shortages, and patience and digging in, helping out. If you're hosting an event, maybe you serve a couple of cocktails, who knows? But that is actually my biggest ask, is for corporate Alberta to recognize that our industry is in distress when it comes to workforce, and it might feel a little bit different. The service levels might feel different than what you're used to.
You got it. You know, when you said that the plumbers convention was at your place, I thought maybe you were going to say that you got them to lend a hand by fixing a couple toilets or replugging the sink or something. It's not that we're not there yet, though, are we?
Well, why don't we close on toilets? During the pandemic, and this was, those hotels were down to 5 people, but they're like, 5 people working in the hotel, but they still have 400 rooms. This was a funny moment. A GM said, well, we have to go and flush all the toilets. They have to keep the water moving in hotels. Like, the infrastructure needs to keep moving. And he was saying, well, we've got to go, I'll talk to you in a couple hours. I got to go flush all the toilets. And it just dawned on me, like, oh my gosh, like, the things you have to do to keep an empty building going. And a commercial building doesn't have 400 toilets.
You would never even think of that. You would never even think of that. Oh my goodness. So, well, thank you so much for putting all of that into context, and thanks for the work that you've done in lobbying on behalf of your industry. It looks like there's a lot of upside ahead, and I'm looking forward to traveling Alberta myself over the summer. So thanks so much for the work that you do.
Thanks, Danielle, and we really appreciate your support.
Yeah, you got it. That is Sol Zia. He is the president of the Calgary Hotel Association. So there you have it. We truly are set to boom if we could just put COVID in the rearview mirror. And it looks like it's going to be something that every city in Alberta is going to take part in, which is, I think, fantastic news. We are out of time for today. Tune back again next week. I'm Danielle Smith, president of Alberta Enterprise Group.